Welcome to the 14th episode of the Film Illiterates podcast, your home for uninformed, unfiltered, ill-advised movie talk. I'm your host, Joe Campbell, and joining me today are Nate Stone.
Hey everyone, how's it going?
And Alex Patton.
Yo.
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 Yo ho, yo ho.
Today we're going to be talking about Pirates of the Caribbean.
Exactly.
Not.
April Fool's.
Exactly.
Oh, that's right. We are recording this on April Fool's Day.
Right,
Yeah.
we got you, Joe.
You're right. Dang. I feel like we should have picked this a little more strategically, but
It just let it happen as
let
it
it
goes.
let it go.
Okay.
Oh, I thought you were going with the Frozen. Let it know.
Oh my gosh, you guys are killing me today.
Why don't you just take it from here now? Where we're killing this more
Well,
than you
bring
are.
the noise and kill the queen, because today we're back with our second Director's Spotlight episode. And today we're going to be focusing on Edgar Wright. Tonight we will be partaking of a cinematic repast as we wend our way up his filmography, commencing with an inaugural discussion on Shaun of the Dead, then on to Hot Fuzz, The World's End, and Shaun of the Dead. Shit, I wrote this wrong.
Way to go.
Anyway, before the last bittersweet analysis of the most fateful terminus, Baby Driver. Leave a light on, good audience, because though we may finish with a twinkle in our eyes, we will in truth be blind, drunk.
And he was pretty much, you were drunk when you wrote this, I guess.
I botched this up totally, didn't do any proofreading, and that's the way I roll.
Honestly, you were actually probably in light and essence of Edgar Wright and actually did your own pub crawl while you were writing this.
I wish I had. That would have been great. I mean, I had one beer earlier. This is another one, but yeah, it would have been great if I had written that in a pub.
Actually, probably Joe's version of a pub crawl is just going outside from his house to his next door neighbors and just asking for beer. And then going to the next house and asking for beer.
Please, sir, I never beg for beer. I just take it when I see it. But as always, let us open up with what we've watched recently. So I just realized I don't think I've gone first, like, ever since we've started this podcast. I'm going to be very selfish and go first today. So,
Sure.
All right, I'm going to kick this off actually in kind of an Edgar Wright frame of mind. I'm going to be talking about one of the movies on his list of 1,000 favorite films. Have you guys seen this list Edgar Wright put together? I think a few years
Yeah.
ago.
It was like
I actually-
maybe a while ago.
So Edgar Wright released a list of 1,000 movies he loves. And I decided to pick one of those since we're going to be talking about Edgar Wright. So I watched Who Can Kill a Child. Who Can Kill a Child is from 1976. A couple of English tourists arrive on an island where all the children have gone crazy and murdering the adults. And it's pretty much what that synopsis says. And guys, this movie kind of wrecked me. Like,
Really?
Oh, yeah.
like this movie is horrifying.
Oh.
Kind of like on a Sallow level, or
No, this movie does creepy kids very effectively. There's something about the kids in this movie that is just so darn terrifying. And I can't place my finger on it. There's a scene early on where they're hanging up this old guy like a piñata and going at him with like a scythe. And something about the way that they're
Jeez.
laughing and playing around is just incredibly unnerving. And the movie just gets worse from there. I mean, as far as like a horrifying level. And maybe it's because I'm a young dad,
Mhm.
but there were a couple of scenes later on that just really got to me. I was like, oh shit, this is I did not know what I was in for with this movie.
Yeah, you probably just had to spend like the next few hours just watching, Teletubbies or something like that, just to kind of get you back to
No, that would disturb me even more.
that would disturb even more. Okay, well, what calms your nerves when you've seen something that?
I don't know, Evil Dead 2.
Okay, there we go.
Of course.
I would definitely recommend Who Can Kill a Child, especially for horror aficionados. I give it props for not going for the jump scares. It's just very unnerving horror.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask, would this kind of fall into the category of exploitive filmmaking as
Oh
well?
yeah, it's absolutely an exploitation movie.
Okay.
And I mean, it's not as violent as a lot of exploitation movies that you would think of. Not in your face, but just conceptually, some of the places that they go, it's just thinking like, oh wow, they actually went there.
I mean, from the way you described it, it's just like from one of the earliest scenes of watching these kids, take down their victims. And just, as you mentioned, it just escalates from there.
Well, yeah, but even that scene is you don't see a lot on screen. It's just more of a
The content,
knowing
yeah,
what's going on. Yeah.
yeah.
So I would recommend it to some people if they're curious.
Okay.
But if it sounds like it would disturb you and like you would be haunted by it, I would say no.
Is it like jump scare crazy or just like
No.
atmosphere? Okay,
No.
good.
No.
I'd watch it.
It's all atmosphere.
Good. Okay, yeah, I'd want to check that out.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you give me a full report, Alex, next week.
Mm-hmm.
Next one I'm going to talk about is a movie that I've been wanting to watch for a long time. Have you guys heard of Roar?
Yes, we
From
have.
1981. Have either of you guys seen Roar?
I have seen bits and pieces of it, and even just that was just enough to make me go, holy cow. Especially when you realize what's going on and just how they were handling these animals. And it's just, how did half of the crew not die from this?
Roar is a 1981 movie directed by Noel Marshall. A family goes to Africa to meet their father who lives with wild lions. I've been excited for this movie for a while, just knowing how they made it. Tippi Hedren is in it, who people may famously know was in The Birds, another movie about killer animals. The movie itself, the story isn't much to write home about. It's literally just this guy lives in this house on this piece of property in Africa, and his family is coming to visit him. And he leaves the house to go do something, I forget what, and the family arrives when he isn't there. But this guy keeps dozens of big cats, like lions and tigers and panthers and all these kind of big wild cats on his property, and he just lives there with them. And the family arrives, and the cats mess around with them for most of the movie, and then he gets home.
More than just messes around with them, like actually knocks them up a few times.
Well, yeah. Well, here's the thing about this movie is that the movie itself is kind of boring from a storytelling standpoint, but just knowing how they made it and that they actually had this little preserve and they raised a lot of these big cats there, and they are just palling around with them like they're treating lions like they're
house cats.
Yeah. And these people are just kind of, they're running around, they're getting knocked down, these cats are jumping up on them, and people got maimed on the set of this movie.
Oh yeah.
Not just the actors, but the crew as well. Like,
Jan de Bont, the guy who directed Speed, he was the director of photography on this movie. At one point, I think it was like a lion or something ran over him and bit his skull, and he got a crack in his skull. It was terrible. So people got seriously injured on the set of this movie, which is funny because the whole point of the movie is to say like, oh, we need to treat these animals with respect. See, they love us too. And this is all about these people living in harmony with these cats. And in reality, everyone got messed up on set.
basically, it was probably like the early version of Jackass when you think about it.
Yeah, it kind of is.
I guess, yeah. It's an extended Jackass skit.
So I wouldn't really say it lives up to an entertaining watch necessarily. The story is very threadbare. There's only so much watching people get messed up by giant cats you can watch before it gets boring.
Yeah, I think just what the big appeal about it is that to know like what you're seeing on screen when someone gets swapped by a lion paw is that's the real deal.
Yeah, exactly. It's knowing the context behind it that makes it interesting to watch. So it makes an interesting one-time watch, but if you're just curious to watch it to see if it's entertaining, it doesn't really hold up. So the last movie I'm going to talk about is a movie that I've been excited about for a while, and that is Dragged Across Concrete from this year, which just came out a couple weeks ago. Directed by S. Craig Zoller. Once two overzealous cops get suspended from the force, they must delve into the criminal underworld to get their proper compensation. So basically, Mel Gibson and Vince Vaughn play crooked cops who get suspended for police brutality when they basically rough up, I guess like a mobster or something like that, a drug dealer. And it gets caught on camera of them being too rough with him. So they get suspended for a few weeks, and they're trying to make some extra money to survive until they get back to the force. So they decide to rob a couple of bank robbers, basically. And this is from the director of Bone Tomahawk and Brawl in Cell Block 99. Both movies I love quite a bit. S. Craig Zoller, the director, he's kind of making a name for himself as the king of polished pulp exploitation on a very kind of languid style. He's very interesting because his movies are very polished. They look very nice, and he takes his time with the scenes, and he lets entire character beats play out. The characters are always really interesting in his movies. They're very layered, complicated, problematic. Everyone has their own worldview in his movies. and he takes time to let Vince Vaughn eat a sandwich on screen for 2 minutes, stuff like that. But this isn't boring stuff. It plays into the characters and getting you to know the characters and seeing how they play off each other. So it's all really interesting stuff. And I think Drive Across Concrete is just another very solid entry in his filmography. I kind of want to see it again, actually, even though it's almost 3 hours long.
For 3 hours?
It's like 2 hours, 39 minutes.
I mean, how much delving into the underground crime syndicate do you need to go for 3 hours?
Well, he doesn't really dive into that so much. I mean, his movies are very pulpy.
Yeah.
And Drive Across Concrete is probably the least quote unquote pulpy of his movies. It's more of just his take on a gritty buddy cop movie.
Okay.
And the villains are, one of the bank robbers is just this insane guy just covered from head to toe in tactical gear who goes out of his way to go into situations where he just wants to murder people with machine guns, basically.
Wow.
And so he has these kind of crazy over the top characters in this movie, and I enjoyed it.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of interesting. Like when I saw who was in it, Vince Vaughn and Mel Gibson, it kind of reminds me a little bit of just going back to Hacksaw Ridge, and like Mel Gibson and Vince Vaughn seem to appear a lot together in films.
Well, yeah, Mel Gibson got the job to be in Drive Across Concrete because Vince Vaughn had worked with S. Craig Zoller on Brawl in Cell Block 99. And when the director brought him back for Drive Across Concrete, Vince Vaughn said, "Hey, I can get Mel Gibson in on this too, because I know him from Hacksaw Ridge." Anyway, that's what I've watched recently. Nathan, what do you got for us?
Okay, so this past weekend I went to WonderCon up in Anaheim, and spent a lot of time just checking out the panels, checking out the show floor. And on Sunday, I got the chance to see with my friends one of the new animated DC movies is going to be coming out. So we got a sneak peek of watching this new premiere of Batman versus the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Now, is this an animated thing?
It is an animated thing, and it's actually based off of a graphic novel as well. So I thought when they pitched this movie, it's like, is this really just out of someone's like, crossover fantasy? I'm like, no, this actually exists in the comic book world. And I was thoroughly entertained. For it being an animated film, kind of like done in the style of like, the DC Batman animated series, this kind of pulls some interesting punches. I mean, the guys who wrote this and teamed up with this was just very entertaining from beginning to end. I thought it was very well done, and just surprisingly, there's some grisly stuff that happens in this for being an animated film. Like there was kids in the audience, and a guy gets beheaded and skewered on screen. Nice. And I was like, okay, that happened.
Yeah, so we got a PG-13 rating. It looks like I was curious because some of the animated DC movies have gotten an R rating, and knowing that Ninja Turtles, I think historically in the comics have been pretty R rated, I was wondering like, did they actually go with R-rated Ninja Turtles this time? But it sounds like not quite all the way there, but close.
Surprisingly, actually, I saw less of the turtles causing some damage with their blades and more actually just using their fists a lot more. Like the ones that actually did a lot more of the beheading was like, Ra's al Ghul's League of Shadows team. And I don't know. It's just kind of jarring when you're watching it. And then suddenly a cop gets his head taken off and you see his body just limp over and you're like, okay, yeah.
That's awesome. I need to check this out now.
The next thing I saw this past weekend was Shazam. So
I am excited for this. I hope to see it in the next week.
Yeah. I won't spoil anything for you, Joe, just because it definitely lives up to what it promises in the trailer, which, let's face it, if anyone's not familiar with Shazam, it's really taking this idea of like, what if a 15-year-old boy was given Superman powers and became a, macho, unstoppable force that could do all these things? How would a 15-year-old kid respond to that? And the movie lives up to that. It actually felt like an 80s kid adventure film, like you would see in the Goonies or Monster Squad or Explorers. It's just taking those kinds of premises and just seeing how a kid would react to it. And so the stakes are very, pertaining to a kid. But I just think Zach Levi, the guy who plays Shazam, just eats up the screen. And he has the right level of humor, right level of banter with the kids in there, just to make it very enjoyable. Like it doesn't get too dark, especially with the villain and what he's trying to do. And I thought it was good and thoroughly entertaining. And they pull a great joke at the very end, Joe. So you need to watch that just because the internet's blowing up about it right now.
I'm very excited for this movie, partially because it just looks really fun. But also the director of this movie also directed Annabelle Creation, which is one of my favorite the Conjuring universe movies outside of First Conjuring. And he had brought sort of a fun sense of spook house entertainment to that movie. So I was expecting him to bring a similar sense of fun to the superhero genre, especially an injection of energy into the DC cinematic universe. So I am very excited for this movie.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you'll definitely get a kick out of it. And then the last movie I'll talk about was Jordan Peele's latest film that came out this past week or past 2 weeks ago, Us.
I saw this too.
Yes, so you and I can probably talk about this. So I don't know. I've been kind of intrigued in following Jordan Peele ever since he released Get Out about 2 years ago, and just seeing where he's going with his directorial career. Just because it's so different, just seeing this guy who started off in Mad TV doing these comedy sketches with Michael Key, and just seeing like, everyone associates him with comedy. And when he does like, these parody sketches with him, obviously they get very stylized and really into the genre that they're shooting. But you watch Get Out and it's kind of like, it's terrifying and yet satirical, and you don't know how to digest it. This one completely goes all thriller, and I loved it. It's basically a story of this family that goes to their beach house, and it turns into a home invasion film where they basically get attacked by another family dressed in red jumpsuits. And not to give anything away, but there's this interesting commentary going on behind the scenes, which at first I wasn't able to catch at the first time. But then after listening to a couple of podcasts, a lot of people's commentary on it, I see now what Jordan Peele is kind of doing, and it just makes me more excited of him as a filmmaker, because I want to see what he's going to do now with the new Twilight series, because this really felt like he was the right person to kind of come on board for the new Twilight Zone series.
So I agree with a lot of what you said, but I'm not as high on Us as a lot of people are, and I'm finding there's kind of a divide between people who absolutely loved it and people who, like me, who generally loved it a lot, but have a lot of issues with it too.
Yeah, I'm not to say like I didn't have issues with it when I first saw it.
Oh yeah, yeah. Because there are scenes that are some of my favorite modern day pieces of horror filmmaking that I've seen in quite a while. That opening is flat out one of my favorite scenes from the past few years. And the way it cuts into the opening credits, and I love those opening credits, and the way he uses soundtrack and mood and atmosphere and doesn't rely on jump scares. The home invasion scenes are fantastic. This is some of the best horror filmmaking we've seen in a while, and we've seen a lot of great horror filmmaking in recent years. But for me, it all kind of starts to fall apart when he starts explaining things, and the more that you find out about what's going on, the more questions I had. And I think this movie could have benefited from him holding back more and not explaining as much and just kind of leaving it more vague, because the more he explained, the more the logic of the world starts to fall apart. And you think, wait, well, how does that make any sense if this and this and this? And that stuff was running through my head during some of the better scenes towards the end. For instance, there's a dance scene towards the end, which is phenomenal. And I would have loved it if I hadn't been sitting there trying to piece together, this doesn't make any sense. Wait, but how can... And I wasn't enjoying the scene. So maybe on a rewatch, I'll enjoy it more. But in the moment, it was very distracting to me. And I think he should have held back on the exposition more. It would have helped the movie out quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think maybe a part of that was because maybe he didn't trust the audience was kind of getting it too much. And I kind of agree with you, Joe. I kind of feel like the movie would have benefited if he had not spent so much time at the very end explaining and really kind of showing the connections of those worlds. Because you're right, it was bringing up more questions than it was answering anything. And I don't know. I think the one thing I loved about it is how there is still this level of mystery, that there's nothing that's really fully explained of what's going on, even like for what the tethered, as the other person kind of explains, and what this is all about. Even though that still didn't really make any sense on why something like that existed, I think it just created a very supernatural, even just like bizarre world that I kind of just feel is very fitting for like a Twilight Zone or even just like a Black Mirror episode.
And I agree that this makes me really excited to see his version of Twilight Zone, which actually premieres tonight. Right after we finish this, I'm going to go watch the first 2 episodes.
Oh, okay, awesome. Yes, I don't know. Watching this made me reinstilled my faith in Jordan Peele. Like, I think he's probably like the best pick right now to kind of like help market as well as like head some of the series. And actually, at WonderCon, I was actually able to check out the panel of the writers and the executive producers who helped on that film. And what's really cool about this, Joe, kind of just foreshadow. I know I don't want to go spend too much time talking about the Twilight Zone. Is they're not trying to copy what they did in the original series, but they are going to place Easter eggs throughout it and really kind of give a sense that it all kind of belongs in the same universe, but they're not going to bring back old stories that they've done. They're going to try to do their own takes and their own news stories with new actors and even like famous actors, but they're really not trying to repeat the same formula. And I don't know, something about that kind of makes me excited and curious. So we'll have to see.
Yeah, I am very excited as well. So you got anything else for us, Nate?
Oh, no, that's it.
Alrighty. Alex, tell us about Overwatch.
Overwatch. I'm watching Overwatch again. I don't remember if I talked about it last time, but the finals happened. So that was really great to watch. But other than that, I mean, now we're just kind of in between stages right now. So
did it turn out in your favor?
No, my team didn't
Aww.
make it. The Dallas Fuel choked at the last possible second, and they didn't even get to playoffs. So
how much money did you lose?
I didn't bet on it. So
is that why you're living out of a bathtub right now?
True. Yeah, that's why.
I like how you don't deny that you're living out of a bathtub. But you're like, no, that's the reason why. There's no other reason.
I use my tears to bathe.
Well, right now, yeah, we're just in between stages. So just kind of waiting on seeing if there's any roster changes right now. Kind of avoiding anything today because, well, any roster changes that are announced today are going to be obviously fake. Mm-hmm. But nothing going on for Overwatch right now. Not a whole lot going on with Destiny as far as content-wise, because that's all the stuff that's happening in this DLC has already been dropped. And so there's not a whole lot going on in Destiny. There's not a whole lot going on in Apex, so they did release the Battle Pass. Mm-hmm. And Battle Pass was kind of not good. It was like all the rewards and stuff like that you get from it is kind of boring. But yeah, that's fine. Division though has come out, and that's been a lot of fun to play. Division 2, I've been really enjoying that one.
You know what you could do while all these video games are kind of in between stages?
What's that?
Watch Death Sentence.
No.
By James Wan.
No, I'm never gonna watch Death Sentence.
So that just so that we can get it out in the open, so everyone can know.
Yeah.
Before we were doing this podcast, Nick and Alex and I were doing this thing where every so often one of us would choose a movie and we'd all have to watch it. That's kind of what Pick a Flick has turned into. Pick a Flick has become in the podcast. But before that, we were just kind of doing this on our own. Yeah, and I think it was Nick picked Death Sentence, the James Wan movie, for us all to watch. Nick and I watched it, and Alex didn't watch it.
Hold on. There was the week or month before where it was one of us picked the movie, like Joe or I picked it.
Yeah, right at your door.
And then Nick didn't watch it until like a month later, and then he picked it, and then like I didn't watch it, and so he's all on my case that I never watched Death Sentence.
But he did get around to watching right at your door.
Oh, he got
you
like a month later. You
haven't watched Death Sentence.
I refuse to, out of principle. Now I am not watching Death Sentence.
Oh, it's a much better movie than Right at Your Door. I'm just saying.
Hopefully, Right at Your Door is not very good.
Right now, I'm just eating popcorn and or listening to you guys as you guys banter about this. This is entertaining.
Every week, I'll come back and ask, "Have you watched Death Sentence yet, Alex?"
And the answer is gonna be no. I'll tell you right off the bat, no.
Next film Illiterates, when you come up,
we're
gonna review it.
It's gonna be the next. No.
We will definitely do that. I feel like that should actually be our next Pick a Flick, Joe.
Oh my gosh, I could totally pick it.
Oh gosh, I'm busy that day that we're recording the podcast. I'm sorry.
Oh my gosh, this is great. All right, let's move on. Let's move on to Edgar Wright. All right, that's what people came to hear.
Okay, John, it's time at the bar.
Let's talk about it. So, hot take: Edgar Wright, good director.
Hot take. All right.
It's okay.
That's my hot take of the day.
Wow.
That's your hot take. All right.
Famous filmmaker. Everyone, I feel like, knows him today. He got his start, or really got noticed, from doing the TV show Spaced. Mm-hmm. And from then on, he did the cult classic Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, Scott Pilgrim versus the World, The World's End, and most recently he did Baby Driver. And so he's kind of made a name for himself doing these high energy, kinetic action comedies. And we're going to go through his filmography in what time we have remaining and just kind of go over the evolution of Edgar Wright, how he's changed as a filmmaker between Shaun of the Dead and Baby Driver, and what makes an Edgar Wright movie. So we're gonna get started off here just with his first movie, Shaun of the Dead. Nate, what's your history with Shaun of the Dead? When was the first time you saw it?
Actually, I'm going to be honest. The first time I actually remember hearing about Shaun of the Dead was kind of from Peter Jackson. I think at the time when Shaun of the Dead was being like distributed and like advertised, it was right during like the peak of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And everybody across the world was familiar with Peter Jackson and what he meant into just pop culture and nerd culture as well. And hearing him kind of like advertising Shaun of the Dead, this like low budget British comedy zombie horror parody, and just like saying it's one of the best films he's ever seen, it just kind of piqued my interest. And I even remember, Joe, I think it was mostly in college actually that a lot of us kind of got introduced to his stuff. I remember you were just always talking about Edgar Wright, like, Hot Fuzz and Shaun of the Dead, and like, oh, you guys gotta watch these movies. And just we'd sit in the dorm and watch it for hours and busting in a gut like every so often, because
which is funny because the first time I watched any of his movies was also in college.
I feel like it's a perfect college movie to kind of get guys and even just anyone interested. And even just in the past 20 years that Edgar Wright's kind of made a name for himself, he's really kind of encapsulated that nerd culture that I think everybody is kind of like riding the wave now, just because his movies are filled with it so much. Like you look at Shaun of the Dead, there's like maybe almost like 30 other movie references in there in one way or another, from the dialogue to the costume design to mimicking shots. It's definitely if you are kind of like in the early stages becoming a cinephile, or even us when we became film illiterates, it's definitely a go-to movie. And I think he just captured that and he just tapped into that so well.
Alex?
I think I'd watched Shaun of the Dead prior to going to college, but then I think I liked it at the time. I think I got into like zombie movies and stuff like that prior, and then I went to college and I watched Hot Fuzz. And like Hot Fuzz just blew me away. I think that's like that or Scott Pilgrim's like my favorite of his movies. It's just so damn good. Kind of ever since then I've really enjoyed his just everything he's done.
Yeah, so since he made Shaun of the Dead, 3 of his movies has been divided into what's been known as the 3 Flavours Cornetto Trilogy. That's Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and The World's End. It's called the 3 Flavours Cornetto Trilogy because they feature a different flavor of Cornetto ice cream in each movie. So it's red ice cream for Shaun of the Dead, blue for Hot Fuzz, and green for The World's End. So I think for the sake of this discussion, we're going to divide the conversation around Edgar Wright into 3 categories. His 3 Flavours Cornetto Trilogy, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, then Baby Driver. So I think we can talk about, because the 3 Flavours Cornetto Trilogy, they're very similar stylistically, and there is kind of a change and an evolution there. But I think for the sake of the conversation, we can kind of lump them together as one extended piece. So here's the thing. For me, at least, these movies, the 3 Flavours Cornetto Trilogy movies, kind of exemplify the ideal of what I think of when I think of an Edgar Wright movie, because all 3 of them are action comedies. Shaun of the Dead is kind of a horror comedy. World's End is kind of a sci-fi comedy, but they're all action comedies to a degree. They all have a similar editing style. They all have similar jokes. They use a lot of the same actors come back. Simon Pegg and Nick Frost in the lead roles in all 3 of them. So what is it about these movies that makes them stand out? What makes an Edgar Wright movie?
I would have to say, if anything, it's the way he handles the camera to enhance the comedy. I don't want to kind of like do a promotion here about other YouTube channel, Every Frame of Painting, but they did a great take on Edgar Wright and how he uses visual comedy in his films compared to what you'd see in most American comedy movies. And he just decides to really utilize the camera and the editing and the music and just sound effects to enhance that comedy to the next level. It doesn't overshadow the performances of the actors, but it just adds that extra level of fun and really makes it much more entertaining and just shows off his chops of being a guy who's so attentive to every detail that's going on, to how that plays into the comedy. And I think that's what, especially in this Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy, you really see early groundwork and foundation of that.
Yeah, one of my favorite things about the comedy in his movies is how he uses editing and sound work to enhance the comedy, because a lot of this stuff is visual and consistent with the timing. So for instance, in The World's End, there's a gag where there's 4 guys on a pub crawl.
5 guys, actually.
5 guys on a pub crawl, right? 4 of them are having beers, and one of them is having a water. And there's a kind of a glory shot of the bartender pulling back the tap, pouring the beer, and it's this really intense moment, and it gets more intense with each beer. And then all of a sudden, all the sound just kind of cuts out as you hear the subdued sound of water being poured.
Spear.
We'll have 5 of those, please.
No, sorry. Can we have 4 of those and a tap water, please?
What? I don't believe this.
Yep.
And just such a funny cut, and the way he does that, it's all about the timing. That's how I think a lot of the comedy works in his movies, because there are a ton of great jokes and gags and a lot of wordplay in his movies. But whenever I think of an Edgar Wright movie, I think of the editing specifically.
Yeah. And even like how he takes that time to actually use the editing, when not even just like having a gag like that, but, you know, showing like what he can do when like a character is going from one town to the next, or going from one place to the next, or even just explaining what their plan is and how it actually unfolds. He uses the editing to his advantage, and he plays off of our expectations that we already know what he's trying to do with this montage sequence, and how he even just breaks that expectation halfway through. It just kind of shows he's very in tune with what we know and how he plays to that.
It was interesting for me this time going through Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and World's End in such short order. Shaun of the Dead, I mean, compared to the rest of his movies, it feels like his first movie, because it's not quite as polished as the other ones. It's still a fantastic, very well done movie. But then you compare it to Hot Fuzz, which just goes all out with the style, and like Hot Fuzz is basically Edgar Wright showing off, this is what I can do with sound and with visuals, and it's
when you actually give me a budget,
very in your face. So Shaun of the Dead is him experimenting, trying to figure out what he can do, what is feasible, how far he can take things. Hot Fuzz is him going full throttle. And then The World's End is interesting because it takes everything he learned from Hot Fuzz, reins it in a little bit, and focuses a lot more on the characters and the emotions and how this all thematically fits together without sacrificing any of the style. So it's almost like World's End is the more matured version. Shaun of the Dead is taking baby steps, and Hot Fuzz is the rebellious teenager showing just going all out.
And in a weird way with the trilogy, you kind of actually show how he's laying the groundwork of his style. But then with The World's End, what I kind of like about it, even though it's like the lesser of the films in his trilogy, what I like about it is how he subverts those expectations or reverses your expectations. Like, you know, in the other two, Simon Pegg plays the straight guy, Nick Frost plays the bumbling fool. In World's End, that role is reversed, and you get to see how he plays off of that and what we know as the audience from his previous two films. And and there's lots of that kind of stuff peppered throughout of The World's End, and I think it's kind of showing a full circle of what is kind of unfolding, and I kind of like that.
Yeah, just as Frost's characters mature over the course of the trilogy, the movies themselves, it just in terms of execution, kind of mature as well.
Have you ever seen Point Break?
No.
Amazing bit in Point Break where they jump over fences.
Is there no? 29.
Patrick Swayze's just robbed this bank. And Keanu Reeves is chasing him through people's gardens. And he goes to shoot Swayze, but he can't because he loves him so much. And he's firing his gun up in the air. He's like, oh.
30.
Have you ever fired your gun up in the air and gone, ah?
No, I have not ever fired my gun up in the air and gone, ah.
30. Sorry, I just feel like I'm missing out sometimes. I want to do what you do.
You do what I do. What on earth do you think you're missing out on?
Gunfights, car chases, proper action and shit.
Police work is not about proper action.
Or shit.
29. If you'd have paid attention to me in school, you'd understand that it's not all about gunfights and car chases.
So do these movies connect in any way? We know that they're all separate movies taking place in their own separate worlds, but why are these three movies considered a trilogy?
Same cast?
Same cast.
I would say so. Same kind of style of comedy and how he builds off of those cliches and tropes and subverts and even just reverts those expectations. But actually, one thing that I think dawned upon me watching Hot Fuzz again for the second time, and I guess I didn't see this for the first time, is how he's actually satirizing British culture or the community in a way. You look at all three films, he's in a subtle way kind of making fun of the UK culture and where it is in this present day. With Shaun of the Dead, he is really trying to show like the mundane routine that most, suburban British folk are kind of subjected to for their part-time jobs, minimum wage things and lifestyles that they have to go through. Hot Fuzz, it kind of satirizes guardian communities in the UK, especially at the very end when it's revealed why the villains have been doing this the whole time. There's no big scheme involved or anything. It's just one little simple thing. And I just love how he kind of just plays to that. And even like the World's End, it's showing, not only how, your friends will mature over age, but just showing how British culture is also changing. Things, that once were like a golden era are kind of like having to be modernized and adapted for this new world that's coming. It's, I think he's saying something about that. And that commentary is kind of interesting. If you watch it, it's there.
One of the things that has always fascinated about these movies is how, to me at least, they're to some degree about maturing and growing up.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you look at the character dynamics between Simon Pegg and Nick Frost in each movie and how they change between movies.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because in the first movie, Simon Pegg plays a man who's trying to grow up, but he's still stuck in this sort of ignorance, this childlike frame of mind. He's a guy that is trying to grow up, but he doesn't know how, and he's holding on to the things that are comfortable. He just wants to do the same things over and over again, and he doesn't want to mature beyond that.
He doesn't challenge himself. He doesn't set goals. And that kind of comes from his friend, Nick Frost, who, basically allows that or gives him permission to keep living that way.
Exactly. So Simon Pegg in that movie is the one who's trying to mature. Nick Frost is just not trying at all, and he's holding him back. And then you go to Hot Fuzz, where Simon Pegg is fully developed as the mature straight man. Mm-hmm. And Nick Frost is kind of the delusional man-child who doesn't realize how out of step with being an adult he is. And then you go to World's End, which is such a drastic change in dynamic. So if Shaun of the Dead is about Simon Pegg trying to mature, Hot Fuzz is about him being fully mature, then The World's End is about him reverting to being a completely rebellious man-child who doesn't want to move beyond being a man-child. He enjoys being a rebellious man-child, and he surrounds himself with people who have moved on and who have grown up and taken a more adult view of life. It's fascinating just kind of looking at these character types play out.
Oh my gosh, Joe, you kind of just painted a picture of just the nerd culture living today.
It kind of is, actually.
Everyone who grew up from the 80s and 90s and where they're at today, I think that is kind of what Edgar Wright is trying to paint with the Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy.
No, I have no doubt that he's in some way commenting on that. I don't know if he necessarily knows he is.
Oh, I think
it's certainly there.
I think he is. I mean, kind of the way you just portrayed like how all three of those films are connected. That's basically what it is. It's kind of like, all of the guys who grew up in the 90s with Nintendo and, PCs and just that, comic book lore, they had to grow up, they had to mature, but then they get to that point where they want to relive those glory days, those wonderful naivety days of innocence, of fun, of being with your friends. And there's a conflict of wills right there. I don't know. I think that's another thing that makes Edgar Wright's comedies stand out from most other comedies is that he is really trying to say something and really showing some good character development in the process.
Yeah, it's especially interesting because Simon Pegg's character in Shaun of the Dead and World's End are kind of two different extremes of the same character type. Mm-hmm. In Shaun of the Dead, he's clinging to the past, but he wants to move on. Mm-hmm. And in World's End, he's clinging to the past and is regressing. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. The whole thing is that whole area, as far as it pertains to these movies, have always fascinated me, and they get more fascinating the more I think about them.
Okay, let's start with Launchpad McQuack.
That's not the actual title of this.
We are Sex Bombs! 1, 2, 3, 4!
Anyway, let's move on to Scott Pilgrim versus the World, which is the one that he made I believe it was in between Hot Fuzz and The World's End, actually.
Yeah, and actually one thing I actually found out is he was actually given this project right after the success of Shaun of the Dead. Like the producers or the person who had the copyright handed it to him saying, I want you to make this. And he spent almost like 6-7 years developing it. And it kind of shows he's one of those guys that takes comedy or just any project that comes in his lap very seriously. Like he'll develop it and make sure he has all the details down and he knows exactly what he's doing.
So, Alex, you told me that Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is your favorite Edgar Wright movie. Is that right?
Yeah, that and like Hot Fuzz, exactly. Yeah.
So what is it about Scott Pilgrim that you love so much?
Well, I like that, kind of going back to what you guys were talking about, and that like the timing and the editing is a big thing with Edgar Wright's movies, and Scott Pilgrim has that in spades. But what I also really love about it is it takes the visuals and just bumps them up a whole couple notches. Scott Pilgrim is, I'd say, one of the most visually interesting and entertaining movies I've seen, just because almost like every scene, every shot, there's something interesting to see. There's something interesting to look at. It's like it's pretty much always eye catching. And so it's just, Scott Pilgrim's like one of the most entertaining films I've seen. I think that's kind of like why the story is fantastic as well. But one thing I also really like about Edgar Wright's movies, and this really kind of shows in Scott Pilgrim, is his use of music. And with, Scott Pilgrim being in a band and it's Battle of the Bands, I love just the role that plays in it, and how he also illustrates and visualizes a lot of these like battles that take place between bands or Scott Pilgrim himself, like that.
Yeah, I would agree that this is probably his most visually stimulating movie, almost to an experimental degree. Watching it this time, I just kind of thought to myself, this is very experimental Edgar Wright. He's trying to do things with the frame that I've never seen anyone else do before. I mean, he does the thing where he changes the aspect ratios depending on the theme, but the aspect ratio will move like within the frame depending on where the focus is, and he'll break it up into chunks here and there, and he throws the captions in, and I feel like he's just having fun seeing what he can do with the shape of the screen.
And also, in a way, kind of, this is like a first time I've ever seen like him use motion graphic text across the screen to the full advantage that it can be done. Like he really brings this whole comic book world that Scott Pilgrim exists in and uses it within the actual setting. Like most people who are adapting comic books would obscure, not even think about putting in like the text when, the old Batman series, when there's like a wham or kabow. Like Edgar Wright decides to use that to advantage to not only just have the text on screen, but to play with it. Like when he gets knocked out, having glass shatter behind him, or, having like the doorbell ring. You see that play across the screen, and it just creates an extra layer of movement to the comedy going on. And it's just something I think was a huge challenge. It would have been a huge risk, and somehow he executed it very well. And I think it just also adds to that fantastical world that Scott Pilgrim exists in. Like, because if you tried to set this in an actual reality, it would not fly.
Yeah, it just wouldn't be the same at all.
No.
It wouldn't carry the same sort of entertainment value and kind of emotion that the movie does.
Yeah, and I think him deciding to take that extra level of adding the 8-bit sound effects or even just that text on across screen, he really is able to set up the stage for the audience to expect what you're going to see is not going to be based in any kind of reality. Like what you're going to see is complete fantasy and fun. So enjoy the ride. Because there comes that point where Scott Pilgrim has to fight, and suddenly everything switches over to this something that would only exist in something like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure.
Yeah,
And
that's a good point.
And I think that's just him setting those little Easter eggs, those little like stepping stones throughout it, is what helped me, at least when watching it, just be on board with this and not kind of like, what the heck am I watching? They're doing ninja fights with swords coming out of nowhere, bursting into coins when they die. What the heck am I watching? It's like you buy into it from early on.
So, what can I get you?
Is there anywhere you don't work?
They're called jobs, something a ball like you wouldn't know anything about. And by the way, I can't believe you asked Ramona out after I specifically told you not to do that.
How are you doing that with your mouth?
Never mind how I'm doing it. What do you have to say for yourself?
Can I get a caramel macchiato?
Yeah, it sets you up in just like kind of the normal scenes of what to expect when you really get going into something. Yeah.
I just realized I actually have seen this comic booky, visually dynamic style filmmaking once since this movie came out, and that's in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse.
Yes, and that's another movie that just used it very well. And it being an animated film, they played around with that so
Yeah,
well.
because Spider-Verse does the same thing where they put, the text on screen and they break the frame up into comic book panels and all that kind of stuff. But that one's an animated movie, and Scott Pilgrim. I was thinking about the level of difficulty shooting a movie like Scott Pilgrim, because you would have to have everything planned out in advance. There was one shot where Scott's roommate opens the door and Scott jumps through the window.
I love that scene.
But the way that the camera moves, like everything has to be planned out, just perfect down to the second ahead of time. As far as moving with Scott jumping through the window and the way it cuts back to knives and the amount of effort into doing this and hoping it pays off is just crazy, and I love it.
Although I will actually have to say, this was probably could be considered Edgar Wright's, introducing his style to American audiences. Like before, he was obviously making films set in the UK, and so it was humor that definitely British people would kind of get. But this was like his first attempt of doing something set in a North American setting, and really just trying to satirize and play to the humor of that. And I don't know, did you guys think in his first attempt this was a success?
I mean, talking about how much I love the movie. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, there we go.
I think it's definitely playing to the audience of the times when it came out, because didn't Scott Pilgrim come out in the late 2000s?
Yeah, around 2010 actually is when it came out.
2010. So again, nostalgia is really big for the 90s crowd, and this movie is playing directly to the 90s kid audience with the 8-bit and the video game references and all that. And so I think he plays into the American sensibilities of that culture very well, and even kind of the man-child characters from Shaun of the Dead and The World's End. Scott has a little bit of that in himself, and the movie's all about him maturing as well, which I think is something that would resonate a lot with the target audience of that movie. So yeah, I agree. Anyway, should we move on to his last movie, Baby Driver?
Yeah, this was your favorite film of 2017, wasn't it, Joe?
It was. I absolutely love Baby Driver. It's actually not my favorite Edgar Wright movie, but it's my favorite movie that came out the year it was released.
It's kind of funny when I went and saw this movie. I think when they were like advertising it, they were trying to say like from Edgar Wright, the guy who brought you Scott Pilgrim and the Three Flavors trilogy. And the funny thing is, it's not really a comedy.
No, it isn't. This is a full-on action movie. It's a very fun action movie, and there's comedy in it, but it's not a comedy.
But here's the thing is, going back to Edgar Wright and just how smart of a filmmaker he is, this is probably one of the best action car chase movies that exists out there.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Everything as far from like what we've been talking about so far about what Edgar Wright's good at, the sound design, the editing, the use of music, the use of color is executed to a T very well. And this actually goes back to that. This was a project he spent 22 years developing.
Jeez.
And it shows, I think.
This movie was also interesting because it's the first movie where we really had no idea what to expect from Edgar Wright, because we had the Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy. And even when it came to The World's End, yes, that was an original project by him, not based on anything else. But we knew kind of what to expect because it's going to fit in with the same aesthetic as Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz. Scott Pilgrim versus the World, that's an adaptation of someone else's work that he took and made his own. This is the first thing we've seen since those, where he's just forging out and making completely new stuff that we have no idea. So between this movie, Baby Driver, and his next movie, which is going to be a horror movie inspired by Don't Look Now and Repulsion, I think we're starting to see Edgar Wright settle into his groove of what kind of filmmaker is he going to be moving forward now that he's made his mark.
Yeah, and so far, like we kind of think about it, Edgar Wright doesn't have too much to his filmography as of right now. Like the movies that we just kind of listed have been like the big, Hallmark films that everyone identifies him with. We haven't had a chance to really get a cemented, style or even just a look of like what makes an Edgar Wright film. And I think this is kind of like you're right, Joe. I think this was the first time we actually got to see all of it toned down, and actually we got to see the core of this is what Edgar Wright is all about.
And his style from those previous movies, you can absolutely draw the line between, Hot Fuzz and Baby Driver, as far as the way he cuts everything together, the way he coordinates his shots and does everything to the music. Because Baby Driver is his most tightly calculated movie. Like every single step has to match up with every cut, with every musical beat, and he had to have planned every single little movement out way in advance for this movie. And so I think this is him kind of working as a craftsman, honing down where everything needs to be down to the second.
So you're just starting your day, or did you just get off?
Oh, I don't know if I ever get off. They call, I go,
So what is it you do?
I'm a driver.
Oh, like a chauffeur. You drive around important people.
I guess I do.
Anyone I'd know?
I hope not.
Well, aren't you mysterious?
Maybe.
Joe, I think I was talking to you early before we started recording this podcast about, all of his films. If you think about it, he's trying to say something in all of his films, whether it's a comedy or just a comic book adaptation. With Baby Driver, do you think he's saying something personal about, his take of just what the American dream is all about? Because I guess watching it this time, I was seeing that. I was kind of like, because it wasn't really catering to any comedy, and you can actually see him, paying homage to famous car chase scenes and car chase films, and just the whole style, even just the romance between Deborah and Baby. It just feels like this is his homage to the American dream. And do you think he's trying to say something about that?
I'm not sure about, for me at least, I'm not sure about the American dream specifically, but this is very much an American movie.
Yes.
Because he has talked about before how he wanted to set this in an American town, with all these kind of taking what he had seen in American action movies in the past and pulling them into here. So there's a lot of action beats that you'll find from previous movies. There's character types you'll find from previous movies, kind of all pulled into this big gung-ho American car chase movie. I'm not sure about the American dream specifically, because I feel like everyone who chases after the American dream in this movie doesn't end up very well in the end.
No.
But I think there's something he's saying about that as well. There's this ideal fantasy that Baby wants to achieve with Deborah, the reality of what he's kind of trapped in. And at the very end, the decision he makes to actually own up for what has happened, I think says something about what I think Edgar Wright is trying to tell all of us about moving forward with the American dream, that we kind of have to sometimes pay our dues and spend our time in order to see the golden light at the end of the bridge. I don't know.
I can definitely see that. And again, that ties into the character type that he seems to like to play around with, is maturing and coming to terms with who you have to become.
Right.
Which again plays into this movie.
Yeah. So he seems to really like this theme of maturity. And I don't know, you're right. He's portraying that very well, I think, in Baby Driver, even though it's not necessarily, playing a lot to the visual comedy that so many people are used to. There's a lot going on there that I think stands out.
The movie is still very funny too, even while not being a comedy, even when there aren't jokes being played. Just watching this movie is fun. There's a scene early on where he's walking to get a cup of coffee. And the way everything cuts together with the music, and he has the lyrics spray painted on the buildings as he walks by, the dialogue and the doors open to the music, it's just toe tapping fun to watch.
Oh yeah. I think it's much more subtle in this movie. Like, Edgar Wright is not really trying to shove in your face, like, get the reference, get the gag. It's really woven into the scene a little bit more intricately, and it's like you have to be I wouldn't say real nerd, but a real connoisseur of music and film and just American pop culture to really see all that. And I don't know. I kind of think it's really him just like toning it down. Like, originally all of his films were at 11, and this is at like a 9, and it's still really good.
I think looking over his filmography, you can see a similar trajectory that we see with a lot of famous filmmakers, where his early movies are just going all out. And as he gets further into his career, he kind of reins it back a bit and uses his best tricks where they fit best, as opposed to, again, as you said, working at 11 all the time. Because we saw this again with Sam Raimi, with his early Evil Dead movies, and his earlier output is just everything going crazy all the way over the top. And then in his 90s, he reined things back and tried to make some more serious, more grounded movies. And he eventually hit a medium spot later on where he kind of is now, where he still uses those tricks he used, but he doesn't always go all out. For instance, in Spider-Man 2, very, very much restrained compared to Evil Dead 2. But then you have the hospital scene, which uses all the same tricks from his Evil Dead movies in that one scene. And he still has that sense of fun and comedy. And Peter Jackson's the same way. Look at his early horror comedies like Dead Alive and Bad Taste and Meet the Feebles. And then all of a sudden, he's making Lord of the Rings, where he's having to restrain some of that. But he's still using some of that stuff he learned in some of the big action scenes and the horror and the comedy. And I think Edgar Wright's doing a similar sort of thing, where he started off going all out as a young filmmaker, and now he's learning how to best implement most outgoing parts of his style into a more restrained movie.
You hint at something very interesting, how a lot of filmmakers, when they're first starting out, they're screaming the loudest with their style because it's really them trying to stand out amongst like all the other competition that exists out there.
You kind of have to at that stage, too.
Oh, you do, yeah. And I think right now with Edgar Wright and even like some of the other names you've mentioned, Tarantino, Peter Jackson, once they found their audience, once they found like people who really get what their films are about, they can tone it down and really actually give them some good meat to actually chew on, so that it's not always like, Shaun of the Dead or Hot Fuzz. You can have something like Baby Driver or even just this horror film that we're going to get from him very soon. It's a chance for him to really kind of share with his fan base and just a lot of just audiences who really understand what his style's about and showing, let me show you something different. I have some other tricks up my sleeve. And I think that sometimes makes a filmmaker much more interesting to watch, because if they're pretty much the same thing over and over again, like Michael Bay, you get the same thing every single time you watch a film. But with Edgar Wright, I think you're getting to a point now you don't know what to expect from him. It makes me more invested to watch what he has.
And it's why I'm so excited for his next movie, his horror movie, Last Night in Soho, because the inspirations that he cited with Don't Look Now and Repulsion are so far removed from what we've come to expect from an Edgar Wright movie that I am fascinated to see with what he comes up with and how he uses the tricks of his trade that he's learned over the course of these years into making what apparently is going to be a quieter, more subdued horror movie. Alex, do you have anything else you want to say about Edgar Wright in general? Anything you want to touch on in any of his movies? What are your thoughts on Baby Driver? Because we talked about how much you love Scott Pilgrim because it goes so over the top. So what do you think about Baby Driver now, when it's a little bit more restrained?
I wasn't as big a fan of Baby Driver as I was of his other movies. I think Baby Driver and then World's End were kind of my least favorite of his. Mind you, I still enjoyed them. Baby Driver I saw in theaters. It was still good. It was a fun movie to watch. But I think I didn't like the movie less so because of kind of his style and stuff like that. The story itself didn't really hook me. And I kind of wish it felt a little bit overlong and without a whole lot of character development from the other characters besides Baby. So I wasn't as big of a fan of it as much as the other stuff. It still does have his style and his unique kind of approach to filmmaking, to setting up scenes and whatnot. It didn't do it for me as well as Hot Fuzz, as well as Scott Pilgrim.
Yeah, which is interesting because those ones really are the ones where he is going on full Edgar Wright mode and really experimenting with his style and going over the top, which I think is interesting because I love all of those movies, but I've always been not quite sure what I've thought of the story and what it's trying to say. And I'm not quite sure about the characters, but it's so entertaining that I almost don't care. Whereas with Baby Driver, because he's a little bit more held back and focusing on the rhythm of the movie, you're almost forced to focus on the characters and the story more, which may or may not hold up depending on your thoughts on it. And if the story doesn't hold up for you, then the style might not necessarily win you back.
Yeah, and I guess when I watch, when I go to watch an Edgar Wright movie, I'm wanting that.
Yeah.
And so because Baby Driver didn't fully deliver on, or at least up to the level of what I had at least wanted or what I've maybe come to expect with his movies, it fell kind of short of expectations for me.
Yeah, and actually one thing I'll actually say, when this movie came out, it had mixed reception from critics as well. I remember actually looking up is that a lot of critics actually were not too fond of the character development in the movie Baby Driver, especially like with the Deborah and Darling character. They felt like those female characters were underdeveloped and didn't really add a lot to just the rest of the cast, which I don't know. I kind of disagree. I think they actually play something very crucial into the whole story and the whole character arc that we're experiencing. And so I don't know. I think you're right, Alex. Like, when you kind of go into an Edgar Wright film, you have those expectations, and Baby Driver kind of subverts those expectations. But I think then what it allows you to do is you have to focus in on different themes that Edgar Wright is trying to bring to the screen. Like, we're mentioning sound design, we're mentioning music, and just how all of that is woven into really telling the story. Which in most like chase scenes or even action movies, sound and music is used to kind of be distracting. It's used to kind of like enhance. Whereas with this, he's really showing how that's playing to the story. And it's a trait in a lot of action movies that has kind of gone away. And I think what Edgar Wright is trying to do is bring it back to show that it is possible to have sound and music play essential parts in what kind of story you can tell with it. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, maybe another viewing is going to kind of change my mind and let me focus on other aspects of the film. But yeah, my immediate reaction was just one of I guess a little disappointment. Not so much, not really disappointment, but just it didn't. Yeah, like I said, it didn't live up to kind of what I was expecting.
Yeah. We'll have to see what Edgar Wright does in his next horror movie, and if he decides to use a song like Baby Shark at some point.
God, what? No.
I like
hate that song.
I like to see how he could use that. That'd be interesting, but I doubt he'll never use it. Let's face it. He's much more mature of a director than that.
Baby Driver is Edgar Wright's worst movie. Changed my mind.
Oh wow! I guess I just changed his opinion. Wow.
Anyway, do you guys have anything else?
I'll
take that as a no.
No, actually, I still think to this day what it would have been like if Edgar Wright had actually directed his version of Ant-Man and how that would have looked.
Oh yeah, I don't think there's any chance that would have happened unless it was a Scott Pilgrim situation where they would have let him do whatever he wants to, because his movies are so tightly wound around his idea, and he plans them out down to the last second ahead of time. Whereas Marvel, I could understand wanting to have a certain degree of freedom to be able to change things and go back later on and tweak them here and there. Whereas I could see him wanting to plan everything from out in advance, do it exactly his way, and then putting it out. Yeah, I was disappointed when it happened, but I think it was absolutely the right call for him to make, because if it could have worked out, that would have been awesome. But I like that he saw that it wasn't going to work out and they were just going to be fighting each other the whole way. And
if
neither one of them would have been happy with the project in the end. And so just bow out early. Anyway, that will conclude our episode of the Film Illiterates podcast. Let us know what your favorite Edgar Wright movie is down in, I don't know, the comments, or shoot us on Twitter. Hit us up on Twitter. Tell us what your favorite Edgar Wright movie is.
Actually, my favorite is actually his music video he did for Beck, Colors. That was actually
I certainly could use more Edgar Wright music videos, that's for sure.
I want every music video from here on out to be directed by Edgar Wright. I want to see what he can do.
Alex, where can people find you?
You'll find me on filmilliterates.com. You can go through our backlog of old Film Illiterates episodes. You can find me on, if you want to catch up with what I listen to music-wise, rateyourmusic.com under Half Scrim, and then Twitter at Alex T. Patton.
Nate?
You guys can follow me on Instagram at Nathan_Stone_films, and here on Film Illiterates. I do these podcasts with Joe and Alex because they're my two best friends in the whole world, and I don't want them to ever feel like I don't care about them.
Aw, we love you too, Nate.
Aw, thank you.
You can find me on Twitter if you search Film Illiterates, Twitter at Film Illiterates, and on Letterboxd Film_Illiterates. I'm also technically on Facebook, but I'm hardly ever there. So, and of course, you can watch all of our videos on filmilliterates.com, including previous podcast episodes and our videos, which we have some of those there as well. I don't think we've done a Edgar Wright movie on a video on an Edgar Wright movie yet, but we certainly should. That'd be great.
Maybe we should just marathon Spaced and just kind of watch that show, because that's one.
That'd be so down.
I'd like to see just the early days of Simon Pegg and just how him and Edgar Wright just played so well off each other.
And until next time, we are the Film Illiterates. Keep it easy.